Deep in the remote hollows of West Virginia, travelers whisper of a hidden family whose isolation warped into something monstrous. Generations of inbreeding twisted their lineage, and starvation drove them to the unthinkable, turning on their own. When authorities finally uncovered the truth, what they found shocked the region, a cycle of secrecy, survival, and horror that blurred the line between humanity and nightmare. The mountain folk had always known something was wrong with the old homestead tucked away in Devil's Creek Hollow. Hikers vanished without explanation. Strange sounds echoed through the valley on moonless nights. Local sheriffs received reports of screams that couldn't quite be human, yet weren't quite animal either. For decades, the authorities turned a blind eye, chalking up the stories to mountain superstition and moonshine-addled imaginations. But when the truth finally emerged, it revealed a horror beyond anything the coal mining communities could have imagined. What drove a family to such unthinkable acts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Artifact, sheriff's crime scene photographs. Polaroid images too disturbing for the official case file, showing human remains in various states of consumption and preparation. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October when the autumn mist still clung to the hollows like cigarette smoke. Sheriff's dispatcher Betty Mae Hutchins had been fielding strange reports for 37 years, but the voice on the other end of the line made her pen tremble as she scribbled down the details. "There's something real wrong up at the old Crowley place," the caller whispered, his mountain accent thick as molasses. "Been smelling death for weeks now, and I seen things moving around up there that ain't natural." The caller refused to give his name, hanging up before Betty Mae could press for more details. But the location he'd described sent a chill through the small sheriff's office. Devil's Creek Hollow had been off limits to most folks for as long as anyone could remember, a place where even the bravest hunters wouldn't venture after sunset. Sheriff Dale Morrison had served the county for 23 years, dealing with everything from moonshine operations to domestic disputes that turned deadly. He was a practical man, built solid like the mountains themselves, with graying hair and weathered hands that had seen their share of trouble. But as he assembled his team for the drive up to the Crowley property, he felt an uneasiness settle in his stomach like bad whiskey. Detective Sarah Mills rode shotgun, her notebook already open and ready. At 34, she was the youngest detective the county had ever hired, brought in from Charleston with a degree in criminal justice and a reputation for thorough investigation. She had volunteered for this call specifically because of the Crowley name. She'd heard the whispered stories since childhood, tales that parents used to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. The dirt road leading to the homestead hadn't been maintained in decades. Morrison's patrol car bounced and scraped over deep ruts and fallen branches, climbing steadily into the heart of the hollow. Ancient oak and hickory trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. When they finally reached the property, the smell hit them first. It was a sweet, cloying odor that made Morrison's eyes water and forced Mills to cover her nose with her sleeve. The smell of death, yes, but something else too, something that spoke of meat left too long in the sun, of decay allowed to fester unchecked. The Crowley homestead sprawled before them like a fever dream of rural poverty. The main house, if it could be called that, was a patchwork of additions built over generations. Tar paper, rough-cut lumber, and rusted tin created a structure that seemed to lean in on itself, as if trying to hide from the world. Outbuildings dotted the property, a sagging barn, what might have once been a chicken coop, and several smaller sheds that looked more like bunkers than storage buildings. Morrison keyed his radio, calling for backup and the coroner's van. Something about the silence of the place, broken only by the buzzing of flies, told him they were going to need both. Mills approached the front porch first, her hand resting on her service weapon. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, threatening to give way entirely. Through a grimy window she could make out movement in the shadows within, shapes that might have been human, huddled together in the far corner of what appeared to be the main room. "Sheriff's Department," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to speak with whoever's in charge here." The response came not as words, but as a low moaning sound, almost animal-like in its distress. Mills felt her stomach clench as she realized the sound was coming from multiple sources, several voices joining together in what could only be described as a chorus of suffering. Behind the house, Morrison discovered what would later be described in his official report as evidence of recent human habitation and possible criminal activity. Scattered around a fire pit were bones that were unmistakably human, a femur, several ribs, what looked like part of a skull. Some showed clear knife marks, evidence of deliberate butchering. Mills photographed everything with the Polaroid camera from her kit, each flash illuminating fresh horrors. A makeshift drying rack held strips of meat that forensics would later confirm as human tissue. Crude tools lay scattered about, knives fashioned from scrap metal, a cleaver with a wooden handle worn smooth by countless uses. When backup finally arrived, they found Morrison and Mills standing in stunned silence beside their discovery. Even the veteran officers, men who had seen their share of violence and depravity, struggled to process what lay before them. The investigation had only just begun, but already it was clear that the whispered legends about Devil's Creek Hollow contained more truth than anyone had dared imagine. Artifact hand-drawn family genealogy chart, crude diagram showing generations of intermarriage within the Crowley bloodline, sketched on brown paper with pencil and charcoal. The genealogy chart was discovered rolled up in a mason jar, buried beneath the floorboards of the Crowley homestead's main room. When Detective Mills carefully unrolled the brown paper, she found herself staring at what could only be described as a family tree from hell, a twisted web of bloodlines that folded back on themselves like a snake, eating its own tail. The chart had been drawn by hand using what appeared to be charcoal and pencil lead mixed with something darker. The lines connecting names were shaky, suggesting the artist had worked by candlelight or lamplight, and several entries had been scratched out and rewritten as if the family history had been revised multiple times over the years. At the top of the chart, written in faded ink, was the name Ezekiel Crowley, 1889. Below that, the family tree spread downward through 5 generations, each level revealing a pattern more disturbing than the last. Brothers had married sisters, first cousins had produced children together, and in later generations the relationships became so tangled that some individuals appeared multiple times in their own family lines. County historian Margaret Fleming was called in to help decipher the document. At 72, she had spent decades researching the genealogies of Appalachian families, but nothing had prepared her for what the Crowley chart revealed. She spread the document across her kitchen table, adjusting her reading glasses as she traced the intricate web of relationships with a trembling finger. "Sweet Lord in heaven," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "This isn't just intermarriage, this is systematic inbreeding over more than a century." The pattern had begun innocuously enough. Ezekiel Crowley had married a woman named Ruth, and their union had produced 7 children. But as the family became increasingly isolated in Devil's Creek Hollow, cut off from the surrounding communities by both geography and their own growing paranoia, the genetic pool had grown dangerously shallow. By the 2nd generation, brothers and sisters were pairing off with disturbing regularity. The chart showed that of Ezekiel's 7 children, 5 had married within the family. Their offspring, the 3rd generation, displayed the first documented signs of the physical and mental abnormalities that would plague the Crowley line for decades to come. Fleming pointed to a cluster of names in the middle of the chart, her finger hovering over a particularly tangled section. "Look here," she said to Detective Mills, had driven out to Fleming's house to review the findings. "This woman, Mercy Crowley, appears to have married her own uncle, then later her half-brother after the uncle died. The children from both unions are listed here, and you can see the notation simple-minded written next to 3 of the 5 names. As the generations progressed, the effects of inbreeding became more pronounced. The chart included crude notations about each family member: born with twisted leg, deaf and dumb, fits and spells, died young. By the fourth generation, nearly half the children were marked with some form of physical or mental disability. The most recent entries on the chart painted an even grimmer picture. The current generation, those who had presumably been living on the property when authorities arrived, consisted of 7 individuals, all the products of unions between close relatives. Their names were written in a different hand, suggesting someone from the family's current generation had updated the document. At the bottom of the chart, in the same shaky handwriting, was a phrase that would haunt the investigation: God's chosen, kept pure in the blood, sanctified by suffering. Fleming had seen isolation's effects on mountain families before, but never to this extent. She explained to Mills how geographic isolation, combined with religious extremism and deep-seated mistrust of outsiders, could create conditions where such practices not only occurred, but were justified and perpetuated. "You have to understand," Fleming said, her voice heavy with the weight of tragic knowledge. "These families saw themselves as separate from the rest of the world. They believed their bloodline was special, chosen. The isolation became a religious practice, and the intermarriage became a way to keep the family pure." The genealogy chart also revealed gaps: family members who had simply disappeared from the record without explanation. Some names had been violently crossed out, while others faded into illegibility, as if someone had tried to erase them entirely. These gaps, Mills realized with growing horror, might represent the earliest victims of the family's descent into cannibalism. The chart served as more than just a family record. It was a roadmap to understanding how a group of human beings could devolve so completely that they would eventually prey upon their own blood relatives for survival. Artifact: original land deed from 1889. Legal document showing Ezekiel Crowley's claim to Devil's Creek Hollow, signed with an X and witnessed by a traveling preacher. The deed was written in the careful copperplate hand of a territorial clerk, its edges yellowed and brittle with age. Detective Mills found it tucked inside a rotted Bible, wrapped in oiled cloth as if it were a sacred relic. The document bore the territorial seal of West Virginia and was dated October 15, 1889, granting Ezekiel Crowley ownership of 60 acres more or less in the remote reaches of Devil's Creek Hollow. What made the deed particularly haunting was Ezekiel's signature, a crude X mark, accompanied by the notation, his mark, indicating the family patriarch had been illiterate. Below that, in different handwriting, was the witness signature, Reverend Josiah Blackwood, traveling minister. The preacher had added a small notation in the margin: "May God have mercy on this isolated place." Standing on the property now, more than a century later, Mills could see how that isolation had festered into something monstrous. The homestead sprawled across a natural bowl in the mountains, surrounded on all sides by steep ridges that blocked it from view. A person could live and die here without ever being seen by the outside world. The main house defied architectural logic, having been expanded and modified by each generation according to their own paranoid needs. The original log cabin, built by Ezekiel himself, still formed the core structure, but over the decades, rooms had been added like tumors, each addition reflecting the family's growing detachment from reality. The second generation had added a kitchen wing, built entirely without windows, a feature that made sense only when viewed through the lens of people who feared being watched. The third generation had constructed what appeared to be a series of hidden rooms, accessible only through concealed doors and narrow passageways. By the fourth generation, the additions had become increasingly bizarre: rooms with no apparent purpose, corridors that led nowhere, and storage areas that seemed designed more for hiding than for practical use. Mills walked through the structure with forensic photographer Tommy Hayes, documenting each room methodically. The smell of death and decay permeated everything, but underneath it was something else: the sour odor of people who had lived without proper sanitation for generations. The floors were covered with layers of grime and refuse that had apparently never been cleaned. Furniture, what little existed, was crude and handmade, fashioned from scrap wood and held together with rope and wire. In what had once been the main living area, Mills discovered evidence of the family's complete regression from civilized life. There were no chairs or tables in the conventional sense, just rough wooden platforms where the family apparently ate and slept communally. The walls were covered with strange markings, some that might have been attempts at writing, others that looked more like primitive cave paintings. But it was the basement that revealed the true horror of the Crowley homestead, accessible only through a narrow wooden door, hidden behind a stack of moldy blankets. The basement had been carved directly into the mountain stone. The ceiling was so low that Mills had to crouch as she descended the crude wooden steps, her flashlight beam revealing chambers that seemed to extend far back into the mountain. The first room had obviously been used for food storage, but the items hanging from hooks in the ceiling made Mills's stomach lurch. Strips of meat in various stages of drying filled the space, and forensic analysis would later confirm that much of it was human tissue. Makeshift smoking racks had been constructed using car parts and scrap metal, creating a primitive but effective preservation system. Beyond the smoking room, the basement opened into a larger chamber that appeared to serve as a workshop. Here, the family had fashioned tools from whatever materials they could scavenge: knives made from car springs, cleavers hammered out of railroad spikes, and cutting boards carved from tree stumps. Everything was stained with what looked like dried blood, accumulated over years of use. The final room was perhaps the most disturbing. It contained what could only be described as a primitive altar, constructed from stacked stones and decorated with human bones arranged in geometric patterns. Candle stubs were melted to the stone surface, and the walls were reffed with more of the strange markings they had found upstairs, but these were carved directly into the stone, with considerable effort. As Mills emerged from the basement into the grey afternoon light, she felt as though she were returning from a journey into humanity's darkest past. The homestead represented more than just a crime scene. It was a monument to how completely a family could disconnect from civilized society and create their own nightmarish reality in the mountain's hidden places. Artifact: anonymous letter to sheriff's office. Warning about the Crowleys, dated 3 years prior, written in shaky handwriting on lined notebook paper. The letter had been filed away and forgotten, buried beneath stacks of reports about stolen tractors and domestic disturbances. Detective Mills found it while combing through old case files, searching for any previous official contact with the Crowley family. The paper was cheap notebook stock, torn from a spiral binding, and the handwriting suggested someone elderly or nervous or both. "Sheriff Morrison," the letter began, "I don't like to be a tattletale, but something ain't right up at the old Crowley place in Devil's Creek. Been hearing sounds at night that don't belong to no animal I ever heard. My dogs won't go near that hollow no more, and they've been hunting these mountains for 10 years. Please check on them, folks. Something bad is happening up there." It was signed "Only a Concerned Citizen." The letter was dated 3 years and 4 months before the anonymous phone call that had finally brought law enforcement to the homestead. 3 years during which additional victims might have suffered while the warning gathered dust in a forgotten filing cabinet. Sheriff Morrison stared at the letter, his jaw clenched with a mixture of anger and guilt. "How did we miss this?" he asked Mills, though they both knew the answer. Rural law enforcement was stretched thin, and vague complaints about strange sounds in the mountains rarely warranted investigation when there were more pressing crimes demanding attention. But the letter was just the beginning. Once word spread that authorities were investigating the Crowley family, neighbors who had remained silent for decades began coming forward with their own disturbing accounts. Ezra McNeil lived closest to Devil's Creek Hollow, his property line running along the ridge that overlooked the Crowley homestead. At 84, he was one of the few people old enough to remember when the family had still maintained some contact with the outside world. He sat on his front porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, as he recounted decades of suspicions. "My daddy used to trade with old Ezekiel back in the 20s, McNeil told Detective Mills, his voice rough with age and tobacco. Said even then the family was peculiar, kept to themselves something fierce. But it wasn't until the 50s that things got really strange. Started smelling death smells coming from that direction, especially during the winter months when the wind was right. McNeil had other stories, each more disturbing than the last. He remembered nights when his hunting dogs would howl incessantly, staring toward Devil's Creek as if they sensed some unspeakable horror. He recalled mornings when he would find his livestock huddled together in the far corner of his pasture, as far from the hollow as they could get. One time, must have been 15 years ago, I was out checking fence line after a storm, heard singing coming from down in the hollow. If you could call it singing, sounded more like mourning, or maybe praying, but the words weren't in English, weren't in any language I ever heard before. The mail carrier, Betty Sue Parker, had been delivering to the rural routes for 23 years, but she had never once successfully delivered mail to the Crowley property. Every time I tried to drive up that road, something would happen, she explained to Mill. Either the road would be blocked with fallen trees, or I'd get the strongest feeling that I was being watched. Made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Parker had eventually stopped attempting deliveries to the Crowley address altogether, returning their occasional pieces of mail marked addressee unknown. She estimated that she had returned dozens of government forms, medical notices, and official correspondence over the years, creating a paper trail that showed the family's complete disconnection from society. The most revealing interview came from Dr. Harold Reeves, who had served as the county's only physician for 47 years before retiring. He remembered treating members of the Crowley family during the 1960s and early 1970s, before they stopped seeking medical care entirely. They would show up at my office, maybe once a year, usually in the dead of winter when someone was close to dying, Dr. Reeves recalled. The children always had obvious signs of malnutrition and neglect. Birth defects were common: cleft palates, developmental delays, physical deformities that suggested inbreeding. I tried to report my concerns to child services, but the family would disappear before any investigation could take place. Reeves had kept detailed notes about his encounters with the Crowley family, and those records painted a picture of a genetic line in steep decline. Each generation showed more severe abnormalities than the last, and the few family members he had examined displayed signs of severe psychological disturbance alongside their physical ailments. The collective testimony from neighbors revealed a conspiracy of willful ignorance that had lasted for decades. People had suspected, had seen warning signs, had even attempted to report their concerns. But the culture of self-reliance in the mountains, combined with institutional indifference and the family's own isolation, had created conditions where the horror could continue unchecked for generations. Artifact-torn school records, incomplete attendance files showing sporadic education attempts for Crowley children, with notes about severe developmental delays. The school records were fragmentary at best, scattered across decades of filing systems and administrative changes. What remained painted a heartbreaking picture of children who had existed at the very margins of society, occasionally glimpsed by the education system but never truly rescued by it. The earliest record dated back to 1967, when a truancy officer named James Fletcher had attempted to enforce attendance laws for the Crowley children. His handwritten report, filed in faded carbon paper, described his encounter with what he called the most disturbing case of echelon neglect he had witnessed in 20 years of service. Fletcher had managed to locate 3 Crowley children, ages estimated at 7, 9, and 11, and had brought them to the one-room schoolhouse that served the remote mountain communities. The teacher, Miss Sarah Beth Coleman, had kept detailed notes about their brief time in her classroom. The oldest boy cannot speak clearly due to severe speech impediments, Miss Coleman had written in her careful script. The middle child appears to have significant hearing loss and does not respond to verbal instruction. The youngest shows signs of malnutrition and what may be developmental delays. All 3 children exhibit extreme fear of strangers and huddle together when approached by adults. The children had attended school for exactly 6 days before disappearing entirely. Miss Coleman's final note about them was brief, but telling. The Crowley children did not return today. When I asked other students about them, several became frightened and refused to discuss the family. One child whispered that something bad happened to them, but would not elaborate. Decades later, social worker Patricia Hendricks had attempted to conduct welfare checks on the Crowley property as part of a county-wide initiative to ensure all children were receiving proper care. Her reports, filed between 1985 and 1987, documented 3 separate attempts to reach the family, each one ending in failure. Access to the property is extremely difficult, Hendricks had written in her first report. The road is impassable except on foot, and the family appears to have constructed barriers to prevent vehicles from approaching the residence. When I attempted to walk to the house, I was confronted by an adult male who spoke incoherently and appeared to be suffering from severe mental illness. He became agitated when I mentioned the children and repeatedly stated that outsiders were not welcome. Hendricks had returned with a sheriff's deputy on her second attempt, but they found the property apparently abandoned, with no signs of recent habitation. Her third and final visit had resulted in what she described as the most disturbing encounter of my professional career. I observed what appeared to be children watching me from the windows of outbuildings, she wrote. When I called out to them, they disappeared immediately. The adult who eventually approached me was so physically and mentally impaired that meaningful communication was impossible. He seemed to be protecting the children while simultaneously fearing for their safety. The living conditions I observed from a distance were substandard to the point of being life-threatening. Despite her concerns, Hendricks had been unable to secure a court order for intervention. The legal system required more concrete evidence of abuse than her observations provided, and the family's isolation made gathering such evidence nearly impossible. The most recent educational records came from a computer database search that Detective Mills conducted with the help of the state education department. The search revealed that no Crowley children had been enrolled in any West Virginia school system since 1989, despite census estimates suggesting that several school-aged children should have been living on the property. When authorities finally entered the Crowley homestead, they discovered 3 individuals who appeared to be in their teens or early 20s, though their exact ages were impossible to determine due to severe developmental issues. Medical examiner Patricia Walsh conducted preliminary evaluations and found evidence of profound neglect and abuse spanning their entire lives. These individuals display the physical and cognitive characteristics of people who have been systematically deprived of proper nutrition, medical care, and human socialization, Dr. Walsh reported. Their speech is limited to grunts and primitive vocalization. They show extreme fear responses to any form of human contact and appear to have been raised in complete isolation from normal social interaction. The youngest of the 3, a female estimated to be approximately 16 years old, bore visible signs of physical abuse and what appeared to be untreated medical conditions. Her legs were severely bowed, suggesting childhood rickets, and her teeth showed signs of advanced decay from malnutrition. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the 3 survivors seemed to understand very little about the world beyond their mountain prison. They had never seen electric lights, running water, or automobiles. They communicated with each other through a primitive system of gestures and sounds that bore no resemblance to any known language. Artifact, Weather Bureau records, documentation of the harsh winters that isolated the family, including snowfall measurements and temperature readings that trapped the Crowleys for months at a time. The weather records told a story of survival pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Detective Mills spread the meteorological data across her desk, cross-referencing the brutal winter statistics with what they knew about the Crowley family's descent into cannibalism. The correlation was unmistakable and horrifying. The winter of 1978-79 had been particularly savage in the West Virginia mountains. Weather Bureau records showed that Devil's Creek Hollow had received over 14 feet of snow between December and March, with temperatures dropping as low as -27 degrees Fahrenheit. The combination of extreme cold and record snowfall had effectively sealed off the remote homestead from the outside world for nearly 4 months. County historian Margaret Fleming had provided additional context about how such weather patterns affected isolated mountain families. Most folks in these parts kept months' worth of preserved food stored up for winter, she explained to Mills. But a family like the Crowleys, already living hand-to-mouth, wouldn't have had the resources to prepare properly. When you're cut off for that long with no way to hunt or forage, people start making desperate choices. The local game warden, Russell Hayes, had kept detailed records of wildlife populations during those harsh years. His reports showed a dramatic decline in deer, rabbit and other game animals that the Crowleys might have depended on for survival. The winter of '79 killed off about 60% of the deer herd in that region, Hayes told Mills. Even if the family had been able to get out and hunt, there wouldn't have been much to find. Mills also discovered records from the county's emergency services, documenting their attempts to check on isolated families during the worst of the weather. Road crews had been unable to clear the primitive track leading to Devil's Creek Hollow, and helicopter surveys had reported no signs of life at the Crowley property. At the time, authorities had assumed the family had either died or abandoned the homestead, but they had neither died nor left. They had endured using methods that would haunt the investigation for years to come. The first hint of what had happened during those trapped months came from forensic analysis of bones found in the homestead's basement. Carbon dating and other scientific methods revealed that some of the human remains dated back to the late 1970s and early 1980s, coinciding exactly with the period of extreme weather isolation. Caroline Foster, a forensic anthropologist brought in from the State University, had examined the older remains with particular attention to cut marks and other evidence of how the bones had been processed. Her findings were both scientific and deeply disturbing. The bones from this earlier period show a different pattern of modification than the more recent remains, Dr. Foster explained to the investigation team. The cuts are more hesitant, less systematic. This suggests people who were unfamiliar with butchering human remains, people who were doing this out of desperation rather than routine. The basement's storage areas contained other evidence from those hunger years. Mills discovered crude calendar markings scratched into the stone walls, apparently used to track the passing days during their imprisonment by weather. The marks showed periods of regular notation followed by gaps that might indicate times when the person keeping track had become too weak or despondent to continue. Hidden in a wooden crate beneath moldy blankets, Mills found what appeared to be a journal written during the worst of the 1970s. The writing was in pencil on pages torn from what might have been a seed catalogue, and the handwriting deteriorated as the entries progressed, suggesting the writer was becoming increasingly weak from hunger. The early entries described their dwindling food supplies and growing desperation. "Ain't been able to get down to the road in 6 weeks now," one entry read. "Snow's piled up past the windows. The little ones are crying all the time from empty bellies. Don't know what we're going to do." Later entries revealed the family's psychological preparation for the unthinkable. Religious justifications began appearing, twisted interpretations of biblical passages about survival and sacrifice. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, and several entries were partially illegible, as if written by someone in an altered mental state. The final legible entry was dated March 15, 1979. "The Lord tests us as he tested Job. What we must do to survive, we do in his name. The weak serve the strong, as it was meant to be. God forgive us for what we are about to become." The weather records showed that the snow had finally begun melting in late March of that year, opening the mountain passes and ending the family's isolation. But by then, the Crowleys had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Artifact coroner's report on infant remains. Medical examination revealing evidence of consumption on the bones of what appeared to be a newborn child, dated to approximately Patricia Walsh had performed thousands of autopsies during her career as the county's chief medical examiner, but the infant remains found in the deepest part of the Crowley basement challenged her professional composure in ways she had never experienced. The tiny bones, carefully catalogued and photographed, told a story that made even seasoned investigators struggle to maintain their objectivity. The skeletal remains were those of a newborn, likely no more than a few days old when death occurred. Carbon dating placed the death sometime in late winter or early spring of 1979, coinciding with the period when the family had been trapped by record snowfalls. But it was the condition of the bones that revealed the true horror of what had transpired in Devil's Creek Hollow. The bones show clear evidence of intentional modification. Dr. Walsh dictated into her recording device, her usually steady voice betraying a slight tremor. Cut marks consistent with deliberate butchering are present on the major long bones, ribs, and vertebrae. The pattern suggests someone with limited knowledge of anatomy, attempting to separate meat from bone. Detective Mills stood beside the examination table, fighting waves of nausea as Dr. Walsh continued her clinical assessment. The bones were so small, so obviously those of an innocent child, that the evidence of what had been done to them seemed to represent the absolute nadir of human behavior. The forensic analysis revealed additional disturbing details. The cuts on the bones were hesitant and imprecise, suggesting that whoever had performed this act was inexperienced and likely reluctant. Unlike the more systematic butchering evident in later remains, these modifications showed the uncertainty of someone crossing an unthinkable threshold for the first time. This appears to have been the family's first experience with cannibalism. Walsh explained to the assembled investigation team, the cut marks are tentative, almost experimental. Later remains show much more confidence and efficiency in the butchering process, suggesting they developed their techniques over time. The circumstances of the infant's death remained unclear, but medical analysis suggested the child had died from natural causes, rather than deliberate killing. This detail would prove crucial to understanding the family's psychological progression from desperate survivors to active predators. Martha Crowley, the family's surviving matriarch, had eventually provided a fragmented account of those terrible months during her psychological evaluation. Her rambling testimony, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, revealed how the family had rationalized their first act of cannibalism. The baby was already gone to Jesus, Martha had mumbled, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the interview room walls. Born too small, too weak. The Lord took him back before we could even give him a name. We was all starving, the living children crying for food we didn't have. Someone said maybe the Lord meant for us to use what he had given us. The psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Robert Chen, a specialist in extreme trauma cases, provided insight into how ordinary people could make such extraordinary moral compromises under extreme duress. His report described the complex mental processes that allowed the family to justify their actions. Starvation affects cognitive function in profound ways, Dr. Chen wrote in his assessment. When combined with severe isolation, religious extremism, and pre-existing mental health issues, it can create conditions where previously unthinkable actions become rationalized as necessary for survival. The infant's remains had been found alongside what appeared to be a crude burial shroud, made from torn fabric, suggesting the family had initially treated the consumption as a solemn, perhaps even sacred act. This detail distinguished their first cannibalistic experience from the casual brutality that would characterize their later crimes. Evidence from the homestead suggested that the family had developed elaborate rituals around their consumption of human flesh, treating it as a religious ceremony rather than simple feeding. Crude altars found in the basement bore traces of human blood, and primitive tools had been arranged in patterns that suggested ceremonial significance. The psychological transformation from this first desperate act to systematic predation had apparently occurred gradually over several years. Later remains showed increasingly sophisticated butchering techniques and evidence that the family had begun viewing human flesh as a preferred food source rather than a last resort. Walsh's final conclusion in her report captured the tragic progression that had begun with one starving family's impossible choice. The evidence suggests that what began as an act of desperation born from extreme circumstances eventually became normalized behavior within the family structure. The infant remains represent not just the first documented case of cannibalism, but the moment when the Crowley family crossed a psychological boundary from which they would never return. Artifact Jeremiah Crowley's personal Bible, annotated with disturbing interpretations and justifications written in the margins, with certain passages heavily underlined and rewritten. The Bible had been bound in cracked leather that had turned black with age and handling. Detective Mills found it clutched in the skeletal hands of what appeared to be the family patriarch, seated in a crude wooden chair in the homestead's main room. The book fell open naturally to well-worn pages, revealing decades of marginalia that documented one man's descent into religious madness. Jeremiah Crowley had been Ezekiel's great-grandson, born sometime in the 1940s, and apparently the family's spiritual leader during their transformation from isolated mountain folk into something far more sinister. His handwriting filled every available space in the Bible's margins, creating a twisted theological framework that justified the family's most heinous acts. The annotations began innocuously enough in the book's earlier pages, with simple observations about scripture that might have come from any devout mountain Christian. But as the notations progressed through the biblical text, they became increasingly bizarre and self-serving, twisting holy passages into permission for unspeakable acts. In the margins of Leviticus, where the original text prohibited the consumption of blood, Jeremiah had written in faded pencil, "The Lord's law for the chosen people in the wilderness. We are chosen too, kept pure in the blood, sanctified by our suffering. What God provides, we accept with gratitude." The book of Deuteronomy bore even more disturbing annotations. Where the scripture spoke of God testing his people, Jeremiah had added, "The weak serve the strong, as ordained by the Almighty. When the Lord calls his smallest lambs home, their flesh becomes sustenance for his faithful." This is the mystery of communion. Elizabeth Harper, a theologian from West Virginia University, who was brought in to analyze the religious aspects of the case, spent hours studying Jeremiah's biblical interpretations. Her assessment revealed a systematic perversion of Christian doctrine that had been crafted to justify cannibalism as a sacred act. What we see here is a complete inversion of traditional Christian teaching, Dr. Harper explained to the investigation team. Jeremiah Crowley has taken biblical passages about sacrifice, communion, and God's provision, and twisted them into a theology of cannibalism. He's created a belief system where consuming human flesh becomes an act of worship. The most heavily annotated section of the Bible dealt with the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac. Here, Jeremiah's handwriting became increasingly erratic, suggesting these passages had been studied and reconsidered many times over the years. His interpretation was chilling in its logic. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son because God commanded it. Jeremiah had written, "We do not sacrifice the living, but when God calls them home, we do not waste his gifts. The flesh of the innocent is blessed. The flesh of our own blood is most blessed of all." Throughout the New Testament, Jeremiah had focused obsessively on passages about communion and the eating of Christ's body. His marginalia transformed these symbolic teachings into literal instructions for his family's practices. Near the account of the Last Supper, he had written, "Take, eat, this is my body. The Lord shows us the way. Family flesh is holy flesh. We eat in remembrance and in survival." But it was in the book's final pages, in the margins of Revelation, that Jeremiah's madness reached its crescendo. Here, his handwriting became almost illegible, the words carved deep into the paper as if written in moments of religious frenzy. "The faithful will be sustained in the wilderness," one passage read. "When the world ends and only the chosen remain, they will eat the flesh of their enemies and grow strong. We practice now what all must do in the final days. We are the first of the blessed." Evidence from the homestead suggested that Jeremiah had used these perverted theological interpretations to maintain control over his family for decades. Surviving family members showed signs of deep psychological conditioning, apparently convinced that their cannibalistic practices were not only acceptable but divinely mandated. Martha Crowley's testimony during her psychological evaluation revealed the extent of Jeremiah's influence over the family's beliefs. "Papa, Jeremiah said we were special," she had whispered during one session. "Said God was testing us like he tested Job, and if we stayed faithful and did what had to be done, we'd be rewarded in the kingdom of heaven." The Bible also contained what appeared to be a record of the family's communions, dates written in the margins that corresponded with periods when missing persons had been reported in the area. These entries were written in a different ink, suggesting they had been added over many years as a kind of sacramental calendar. Dr. Harper's final assessment of Jeremiah's biblical annotations painted a picture of systematic religious indoctrination used to normalize horrific acts. "This represents one of the most complete examples of theological manipulation I've encountered," she wrote. Jeremiah Crowley didn't just practice cannibalism, he created an entire religious framework that made it seem not only acceptable but holy. Artifact missing person reports, stack of unsolved cases from the surrounding counties, spanning 30 years, with several reports describing last known locations near Devil's Creek Hollow. The missing person files filled 3 cardboard boxes, representing decades of unsolved disappearances from across the Tri-County area. Detective Mills had requested all cases where individuals had vanished within a 50-mile radius of Devil's Creek Hollow, and the sheer volume of reports painted a disturbing picture of predation spanning multiple generations. The theorist report dated back to 1981, just 2 years after the harsh winter that had apparently triggered the Crowley family's descent into cannibalism. 33-year-old hiker named David Kellerman had disappeared while backpacking the Appalachian Trail. His abandoned campsite had been found less than 5 miles from the Crowley property, his gear scattered as if he had left in a hurry or been forced to abandon it. State Trooper Harold Beck had investigated Kellerman's disappearance and filed a report that showed disturbing pressures. Subject's campsite shows signs of hasty departure, Beck had written. Food supplies left behind suggest subject did not leave voluntarily. Local residents report seeing unknown individuals in the area around the time of disappearance. Recommend expanded search of remote properties in Devil's Creek region. But the recommendation had never been followed up. The case had been classified as a voluntary missing person after investigators failed to find evidence of foul play, and Kellerman had joined the growing list of people who had simply vanished in the mountains. The pattern became clearer as Mills worked through the chronological file. Every few years, someone would disappear in the general vicinity of the Crowley homestead. Sometimes they were hikers or hunters, people who might have wandered onto the property by accident. Other times they were locals, drifters, transients, or people whose absence might not be immediately noticed. In 1987, a middle-aged woman named Carol Jensen had disappeared while driving to her sister's house in the next county. Her car had been found abandoned on a logging road that, according to Mills' map, led directly toward Devil's Creek Hollow. The vehicle showed no signs of mechanical trouble, and Jensen's purse and identification remained inside, suggesting she had left the car voluntarily or been forced out. The investigating officer, Deputy Raymond Morse, had noted several peculiar details about the scene. Vehicle appears to have been moved after initial abandonment, his report stated. Tire tracks in mud suggest car was pushed approximately 50 yards from road. No signs of struggle, but passenger door was found ajar, and subject's jacket was located 200 yards away, torn and bloody. Despite these suspicious circumstances, the case had been handled as a missing person rather than a potential homicide. The rugged terrain and harsh weather had limited search efforts, and Jensen's case had eventually gone cold like so many others. One of the most heartbreaking files belonged to 16-year-old Michael Torres, who had disappeared in 1994 while camping with friends in the state forest. Torres had been arguing with his companions about their planned route and had apparently stormed off into the woods alone. His friends had waited until morning to report him missing, assuming he would return on his own. The search for Torres had been extensive, involving state police, volunteer searchers, and tracking dogs. But the trail had gone cold at a creek bed roughly 3 miles from the Crowley property. Search Coordinator Lieutenant James Sullivan had noted in his final report that the dogs had seemed reluctant to continue tracking beyond that point, becoming agitated and refusing to follow what appeared to be a clear scent trail. Canine units showed unusual behavior at creek crossing, Sullivan had written. Dogs became extremely distressed and would not proceed further, despite clear indication that subject had passed through area. Handlers report animals showed fear response consistent with detecting predator scent. The most recent disappearance had occurred just 8 months before the anonymous tip that led to the discovery of the Crowley homestead. Margaret Winfrey, a 42-year-old real estate agent, had vanished while showing property potential buyers in a remote area. Her car had been found with the engine still running, her cell phone on the seat and her purse untouched. What made Winfrey's case particularly significant was the location where her car had been discovered, less than 2 miles from the entrance to the old logging road that led to Devil's Creek Hollow. Forensic analysis of evidence found at the Crowley property would later reveal personal items that had belonged to several of the missing persons, including Winfrey's distinctive silver bracelet. The cumulative evidence suggested that the Crowley family had evolved from desperate survivors who had resorted to cannibalism during extreme circumstances into active predators who hunted human prey. The geographic pattern of disappearances, the timeline of cases, and the physical evidence found at the homestead painted a picture of systematic predation that had claimed lives across 3 decades. Artifact, handwritten confession letter, rambling account from surviving matriarch Martha Crowley, written on paper torn from a hymnal describing the family's traditions and justifications. The letter had been written in pencil on pages torn from an old hymnal, the faded musical notes still visible beneath Martha Crowley's shaky handwriting. She had pressed the pencil so hard in some places that it had torn through the thin paper, creating holes that made certain words illegible. The document was discovered hidden beneath her mattress in the psychiatric facility where she was being held for evaluation. Martha was 67 years old, though malnutrition and a lifetime of inbreeding had aged her far beyond her years. Her face bore the distinctive features common to the Crowley bloodline, a pronounced underbite, widely spaced eyes, and the telltale signs of fetal alcohol syndrome that suggested her own mother had struggled with addiction. When she spoke, her words came in a mixture of mountain dialect and the primitive communication system the family had developed over decades of isolation. Robert Chen had been working with Martha for 3 weeks when she had suddenly begun writing the confession letter during what should have been a routine therapy session. She had asked for paper and pencil, then spent the next 4 hours scribbling furiously while muttering to herself in the strange hybrid language the family used among themselves. The letter began with what appeared to be an attempt to justify the family's actions through their twisted religious beliefs. "We ain't bad people like they all say," Martha had written. "We was chosen by the Lord to survive when others couldn't. Papa Jeremiah taught us that the weak serve the strong, and when God calls his children home, he don't want nothing to go to waste." As the confession continued, Martha's account revealed the complex hierarchy that had governed the Crowley family for generations. The eldest male had always served as the family's spiritual leader and decision-maker, interpreting their perverted religious doctrine and determining which family members would be sacrificed when food became scarce. Papa Jeremiah said the Lord told him which ones had to go first. Martha wrote, "Always the sickest ones, or the ones who couldn't make babies no more. That's how we knew God wanted it that way. He would take the weak ones in the winter when we needed meat the most. The letter described in disturbing detail how the family had developed elaborate rituals around their cannibalistic practices. What had begun as desperate survival had evolved into a complex system of religious ceremony and social control that governed every aspect of their lives. "We had the blessing ceremony before every feeding," Martha explained in her rambling script. "Papa would read from the good book and explain how we was doing the Lord's work. The little ones had to watch so they'd understand when their time came. Everybody had to eat, even the baby. That's how you stayed in the family." Dr. Chen's analysis of Martha's testimony revealed the psychological mechanisms that had allowed the family to normalize such extreme behavior across multiple generations. Her confession showed how religious indoctrination, combined with severe isolation and genetic deterioration, had created a closed system where cannibalism was not only accepted but viewed as sacred duty. The most chilling passages in Martha's letter dealt with how the family had begun actively hunting human prey rather than simply waiting for family members to die. She described a gradual transition that had occurred sometime in the 1980s when the family had started venturing beyond their property to find victims. "Papa said the Lord was testing our faith by making the family smaller," she wrote. "We was supposed to go out and bring back the ones he sent to us. They wasn't really people like us. They was gifts from God like the deer and rabbits, but better, meat that would last longer." Martha's account revealed that the family had developed sophisticated techniques for luring victims to their property. They would stage fake emergencies, pose as lost travelers in need of help, or simply wait for hikers and hunters to wander too close to their territory. "We knowed all the trails and hunting spots for miles around," she continued. "Papa taught us how to make the sounds that would bring them closer, crying like a hurt woman or calling for help like we was lost. Most times they'd come running to help, and then we'd take them home for the blessing ceremony." The letter also described how the family had dealt with their victims' belongings, often keeping personal items as trophies while disposing of clothing and identification in remote mountain caves. This explained why so many missing person cases in the area had never been solved. The evidence had been deliberately hidden in locations that would never be searched. Martha's final paragraphs revealed her continued belief that the family's actions had been divinely sanctioned, even after their discovery by authorities. "They say we done wrong, but they don't understand the Lord's plan," she concluded. "We kept his chosen people alive when the world tried to kill us. Maybe now he's ready for us to go to our reward." Artifact medical examination records, documentation of physical and developmental abnormalities found in the 3 surviving Crowley children, including X-rays showing bone deformities and malnutrition effects. The medical records painted a heartbreaking portrait of what generations of inbreeding and systematic abuse could do to the human form. Patricia Walsh had overseen the initial examination of the 3 surviving Crowley children found at the homestead, and her detailed documentation revealed the full extent of their physical and developmental damage. The oldest survivor, a male estimated to be in his early 20s, showed classic signs of severe developmental delays caused by both genetic factors and profound neglect. His medical chart listed a litany of abnormalities that read like a catalogue of human suffering: severe scoliosis that had twisted his spine into an S-curve, partial blindness in his left eye, and a cleft palate that had never been surgically corrected. Patient exhibits significant cranial abnormalities consistent with fetal alcohol syndrome and possible microcephaly, Dr. Walsh had noted in her initial assessment. Facial features show pronounced asymmetry, with the left side of the face approximately 20% smaller than the right. Teeth are severely malformed and show extensive decay, consistent with malnutrition and lack of dental care. X-rays of the young man's bones revealed a lifetime of inadequate nutrition. His legs showed evidence of childhood rickets that had never been treated, leaving them bowed and shortened. His rib cage was deformed, creating a barrel chest that made breathing difficult. Most disturbing of all, his skull X-rays showed areas where the bone had never properly fused, leaving soft spots that should have closed in infancy. The middle child, a female estimated to be 18 or 19 years old, presented even more severe abnormalities. Her medical examination revealed that she had been born with spina bifida, a condition that had left her partially paralyzed from the waist down. Without proper medical intervention, the condition had worsened over the years, and she was now unable to walk unassisted. Patient shows signs of chronic infection and bed sores consistent with long-term immobility. Dr. Walsh documented. Neurological examination reveals significant cognitive impairment, with patient responding only to basic stimuli. Speech appears limited to grunts and simple vocalizations. Patient exhibits extreme fear response to any human contact. The youngest survivor was perhaps the most tragic case. A female estimated to be 15 or 16 years old, she bore physical evidence of systematic sexual abuse that had apparently begun in early childhood. Her medical examination revealed scarring and deformities that suggested repeated trauma over many years. Patient presents with multiple indicators of long-term sexual abuse. Dr. Walsh wrote in carefully clinical language. Physical examination reveals extensive scarring and malformation of reproductive organs. Patient is currently pregnant, estimated to be in the second trimester. Genetic testing will be required to determine paternity, though family relationships suggest high probability of incestuous conception. All three survivors showed signs of severe malnutrition that went beyond simple hunger. Blood tests revealed deficiencies in virtually every essential vitamin and mineral, suggesting a diet that had consisted primarily of whatever the family could scavenge or hunt. Their teeth were in particularly poor condition, with extensive decay and several missing molars that had apparently been removed without proper dental care. Elizabeth Morrison, a developmental pediatrician brought in to assess the survivors' cognitive abilities, found that all three functioned at the level of young children, despite their physical ages. None could read, write, or perform basic mathematical operations. Their understanding of the world beyond their mountain prison was virtually non-existent. These individuals have been raised in complete isolation from normal human society, Dr. Morrison reported. They show no understanding of basic concepts like money, television, automobiles, or electric lighting. Their vocabulary is extremely limited, and they communicate primarily through gestures and primitive vocalizations that appear to be unique to their family group. The survivors' behavioral patterns revealed the extent of their psychological conditioning. They showed extreme fear of authority figures and would huddle together whenever strangers approached. They refused to eat unfamiliar foods and seemed to expect punishment for any deviation from rigid behavioral patterns that had apparently governed their lives in the hollow. Social worker Jennifer Hayes, who had been assigned to oversee the survivors' care, documented their daily behaviors with a mixture of professional compassion and personal horror. Her notes revealed individuals who had been so completely separated from normal human development that they might never be able to function independently. The oldest male spends most of his day rocking back and forth while humming what appears to be hymnal music, Hayes wrote. He becomes agitated when prevented from performing what seem to be ritualistic behaviors, arranging objects in specific patterns, touching surfaces a predetermined number of times, and muttering phrases that sound like distorted prayers. The medical team's greatest challenge was determining how to care for individuals whose entire worldview had been shaped by cannibalism and religious extremism. The survivors showed no understanding that their families' practices had been wrong, and they continued to expect their meals to consist of human flesh, prepared according to their twisted ceremonial traditions. Artifact local newspaper headlines, collection showing the community's shock and shame, including front pages from the Charleston Gazette and smaller regional papers documenting the unfolding horror. The newspaper clippings told the story of a community grappling with unthinkable horror. In their midst, Detective Mills had collected headlines from across West Virginia and neighboring states, creating a timeline of how the Crowley case had shattered the region's sense of security and self-understanding. The first headline had appeared in the Charleston Gazette 3 days after the discovery, "Cannibal Family Discovered in Remote W." The accompanying photograph showed Sheriff Morrison standing grimly beside his patrol car, the Crowley homestead visible in the background like something from a nightmare. The article's lead paragraph captured the community's initial disbelief. Authorities in rural Preston County are investigating what may be the most horrific case of family violence in West Virginia history, involving allegations of cannibalism and decades of isolation in the state's remote mountain regions. Within a week, the story had exploded into national news. The New York Times ran a feature titled "Appalachian Gothic: The Dark Side of Mountain Isolation." Time magazine followed with "The Hollow People: When Poverty and Isolation Turn Deadly." Each article brought more reporters, photographers, and curiosity seekers to the small mountain communities that had long prided themselves on their privacy and self-reliance. The local reaction was immediate and devastating. The Morgantown Dominion Post captured the community's shame in a headline that read, "How did we not know?" The article included interviews with neighbors who had suspected something was wrong, but had never acted on their suspicions. "We failed those children," local resident Mary Ellen Foster told the newspaper. "All of us knew something wasn't right up in that hollow, but we minded our own business like we always do. Now we find out people were dying while we looked the other way." The Clarksburg Exponent ran a series of articles exploring how the case reflected broader issues in Appalachian communities. Their headline, "Poverty and Isolation: A Deadly Combination," introduced readers to the complex social and economic factors that had allowed the Crowley family's horror to continue unchecked for generations. James Hartwell was quoted extensively in the series, explaining how the region's history of coal mining, population decline, and geographic isolation had created conditions where families could disappear from society entirely. What happened to the Crowley family represents the extreme end of a continuum that affects many rural Appalachian communities, Dr. Hartwell explained. When economic opportunities disappear and services are cut, some families become so isolated that they exist completely outside normal social structures. Usually this just means poverty and neglect, but in extreme cases like this one, it can lead to complete social breakdown. The religious communities struggled to respond to revelations about how twisted theology had justified the family's practices. The Beckley Register-Herald ran a front-page story titled "Faith Turned to Horror" that included statements from local ministers trying to distance legitimate Christianity from Jeremiah Crowley's perverted interpretation. Reverend William Thompson of the First Baptist Church of Kingwood was quoted as saying, "What we see in the Crowley case is not Christianity but a complete perversion of God's word. These people took scripture out of context and twisted it to justify evil acts. This has nothing to do with true faith." The tourism industry, crucial to the region's economy, began showing immediate effects from the negative publicity. The Preston County Tourism Board found itself fielding calls from reporters and curiosity seekers rather than legitimate visitors. Hotel bookings dropped dramatically as the area became associated with horror rather than natural beauty. "We've worked for decades to change people's perceptions about Appalachia," Tourism Director Sandra Mitchell told the Fairmont Times. "One case like this sets us back 20 years. People will think we're all backward mountain people living like savages." The case also sparked intense debate about social services and government oversight in rural areas. The Charleston Daily Mail ran an investigative series titled "The System's Failures" that documented how multiple agencies had received warnings about the Crowley family over the years, but had failed to intervene effectively. Child Protective Services came under particular scrutiny. Their spokesperson, Janet Reynolds, was quoted in multiple newspapers defending the agency's actions. "We responded to every complaint we received about the Crowley family, but we can't remove children from homes without legal court. The family's isolation and their threats against our workers made investigation extremely difficult." The most painful headlines dealt with the community's collective guilt. The Elkins Intermountain ran an editorial titled "We All Share the Blame" that forced readers to confront their own complicity in allowing the horror to continue. "For decades we whispered about strange sounds from Devil's Creek Hollow," the editorial stated. "We joked about the crazy Crowleys and told our children to stay away from that part of the mountains. But we never asked ourselves what was really happening to the people living there." We failed in our most basic human duty to protect the vulnerable. Artifact FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit Report. Psychological profile of the family's devolution from isolated mountain clan to systematic cannibals. Prepared by federal behavioral specialists. The FBI report arrived 3 weeks after federal agents had joined the investigation, bringing with them resources and expertise that the rural sheriff's department had never encountered. The document, stamped confidential and bearing the seal of the Behavioral Analysis Unit, represented the culmination of intensive psychological profiling by some of the nation's leading experts in extreme criminal behavior. Special Agent Catherine Reeves had spent 15 years studying cases of family violence and cult behavior. But the Crowley case challenged even her extensive experience with human depravity. Her team had analyzed everything from the family's twisted religious writings to the physical layout of their property, creating a comprehensive psychological portrait of how ordinary people could descend into systematic cannibalism. The Crowley family represents a unique convergence of factors that created conditions conducive to extreme deviant behavior. Dr. Reeves wrote in her executive summary, geographic isolation, genetic deterioration through inbreeding, economic desperation, and religious extremism combined over multiple generations to produce a family unit that operated entirely outside normal social constraints. The report identified 5 distinct phases in the family's psychological evolution, beginning with their initial settlement in Devil's Creek Hollow. The first phase, lasting roughly 40 years, had been characterized by typical rural poverty and isolation, but no evidence of criminal behavior beyond minor property crimes and tax evasion. The second phase had begun during the Great Depression, when economic hardship had driven the family to complete self-sufficiency and increasing paranoia about outsiders. FBI analysis of historical records showed that this was when the family had first begun practicing systematic inbreeding, justified through their increasingly extremist religious beliefs. By the 1940s, the Crowley family had developed what we term fortress mentality, the report explained. They viewed the outside world as hostile and corrupting, while seeing themselves as chosen people who needed to maintain their purity through isolation and selective breeding. This psychological framework laid the groundwork for later justification of cannibalistic practices. The third phase had occurred during the late 1970s and early 1980s, coinciding with the severe winters that had trapped the family for months at a time. This was when desperation had first driven them to consume deceased family members, beginning with infants who had died from natural causes. The transition from normal grief and burial practices to cannibalism represents a critical psychological threshold. Dr. Reeves noted, once the family had crossed this boundary and developed religious justifications for their actions, the practice became normalized within their social structure. What began as desperate survival became ritualized behavior. The fourth phase had marked the family's evolution from passive cannibalism to active predation. FBI behavioral analysts had studied the geographic pattern of missing persons in the area and concluded that the Crowleys had begun deliberately hunting human prey sometime in the mid-90s. The escalation from consuming deceased family members to actively killing strangers represents a significant psychological shift, the report stated. The family had developed sufficient justification for their practices that they no longer felt constrained by normal moral boundaries. They had created an internal belief system where humans outside their bloodline were viewed as legitimate prey. The fifth and final phase had been characterized by complete systemization of their cannibalistic practices. By the 2000s, the family had developed elaborate hunting strategies, sophisticated preservation techniques, and complex religious ceremonies that made human consumption a central element of their daily existence. Marcus Chen had conducted detailed interviews with surviving family members, using specialized techniques developed for cult deprogramming. His findings revealed the extent to which religious indoctrination had shaped the family's worldview. The surviving Crowley family members show no understanding that their practices were morally wrong. Dr. Chen wrote, They have been so completely isolated from normal social development that they lack the basic ethical framework that prevents such behavior in typical populations. Their religious conditioning has created a complete inversion of normal moral values. The report also analyzed the family's social structure, identifying a rigid hierarchy that had been maintained through fear, religious indoctrination, and systematic abuse. The eldest male had served as both patriarch and high priest, interpreting their twisted theology and determining which family members would be sacrificed during times of scarcity. The Crowley family operated as a closed totalitarian system, Dr. Reeves explained. Dissent was impossible because family members had no frame of reference for normal behavior. Those who showed signs of questioning the family's practices were quickly identified as potential victims, creating a system where compliance was literally a matter of survival. The FBI's final assessment concluded that the Crowley case represented one of the most extreme examples of family devolution ever documented in American criminal history. The report recommended immediate federal intervention to ensure that surviving family members received appropriate psychiatric care and that similar cases might be prevented through improved monitoring of isolated rural communities. Artifact, court transcripts. Key testimony from the preliminary hearings, including competency evaluations and arguments about the defendant's ability to stand trial. The courthouse in Kingwood had never seen anything like the media circus that descended when the Crowley trials began. Judge Patricia Blackwood had presided over the county court for 18 years, handling everything from property disputes to domestic violence cases, but the stack of court transcripts from the preliminary hearings represented the most complex legal challenge of her career. The first and most fundamental question facing the court was whether any of the surviving Crowley family members were mentally competent to stand trial. The transcript from the initial competency hearing revealed the extraordinary difficulties prosecutors faced in seeking justice for crimes that defied normal legal frameworks. Your Honor, began Assistant District Attorney Michael Harrison, the state contends that despite their obvious mental impairments, the defendants understood the nature of their actions and should be held accountable for the systematic murder of multiple victims over a period of decades. Defense Attorney Janet Rodriguez, appointed by the court to represent Martha Crowley, argued that her client was so severely mentally ill that she could not assist in her own defense. The transcript showed her making an impassioned plea for psychiatric treatment rather than criminal prosecution. Mrs. Crowley has been raised in complete isolation from normal society, Rodriguez stated. She has no understanding of legal concepts like guilt, innocence, or even basic human rights. She literally does not comprehend that her actions were wrong because she has been conditioned from birth to believe they were religiously mandated. The court ordered psychiatric evaluation of Martha Crowley, conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell of the state hospital system, was read into the record during the competency hearing. Her findings painted a picture of someone so damaged by a lifetime of abuse and indoctrination that normal legal proceedings seemed almost meaningless. The defendant exhibits severe cognitive impairment consistent with fetal alcohol syndrome, malnutrition, and possible genetic abnormalities, Dr. Mitchell testified. She speaks primarily in a primitive dialect that appears to be unique to her family group. When asked about the charges against her, she responds with religious justifications that suggest she has no understanding of legal or moral culpability. The transcript revealed that Martha repeatedly interrupted the proceedings to ask when she would be allowed to return home to Devil's Creek Hollow, apparently unable to understand that the homestead had been sealed as a crime scene. When Judge Blackwood explained that she was being charged with murder, Martha responded with confusion rather than fear. "I don't understand what you mean by murder," Martha had said, according to the court stenographer. "We was just following Papa Jeremiah's teachings. The Lord provides, and we don't waste his gifts. Why is that wrong?" The competency hearing for the oldest male survivor, identified through DNA testing as Martha's nephew Thomas, presented even greater challenges. The transcript showed that he was completely non-verbal during court proceedings, communicating only through grunts and gestures that no one outside his immediate family could interpret. Robert Chen, The psychiatrist who had been working with Thomas since his discovery testified about the young man's severe developmental limitations. The defendant functions at approximately the level of a 5-year-old child, Dr. Chen told the court. He has no understanding of the legal system, no concept of right and wrong as defined by society, and no ability to assist in his own defense. Public defender William Hayes, representing Thomas, argued that prosecuting someone with such severe mental disabilities would violate both state and federal standards for criminal competency. The transcript showed him making a plea that resonated beyond the immediate case. "Your Honor, this young man is as much a victim as any of the people his family killed," Hayes argued. "He was born into a system of abuse and indoctrination that he had no power to escape. Prosecuting him for crimes he committed while under complete psychological control would be a miscarriage of justice." The prosecution faced additional challenges in determining exactly which family members should be charged with which specific crimes. The transcript revealed that investigators had identified remains from at least 14 victims, but the family's practice of consuming their victims completely had made individual identification nearly impossible. "We have clear evidence that these defendants participated in the systematic killing and consumption of multiple victims," Ada Harrison stated. However, the degraded condition of the remains and the defendants' own mental states make it difficult to establish individual culpability for specific murders. The preliminary hearing transcripts also documented the community's desire for justice, despite the extraordinary circumstances. Victim impact statements from families of missing persons created some of the most emotionally charged moments in the proceedings. "My daughter Margaret Winfrey was murdered by these people," testified Robert Winfrey, his voice breaking according to the court reporter's notes. "I don't care how mentally ill they are or what kind of upbringing they had. They took my baby away from her children, and somebody needs to pay for that." Judge Blackwood's ruling on competency preserved in the transcript reflected the unprecedented nature of the case and the difficulty of applying normal legal standards to such extraordinary circumstances. Artifact, Psychiatric Evaluation Summary, professional assessment of the family's mental states compiled from multiple expert examinations, including genetic counselors, anthropologists, and forensic psychiatrists. The Psychiatric Evaluation Summary represented the collective findings of 8 different specialists who had examined the Crowley family over a period of 6 months. Margaret Foster, the court-appointed coordinator, had synthesized their reports into a comprehensive assessment that would determine the legal fate of the surviving family members. The document began with the findings of Dr. William Brennan, a genetic counselor from Johns Hopkins University who had been brought in to assess the physical and mental effects of generations of inbreeding. His analysis of the family's DNA revealed genetic damage that went far beyond what most medical professionals had ever encountered. The Crowley family represents one of the most extreme mercies of genetic deterioration resulting from systematic inbreeding that has been documented in modern medical literature, Dr. Brennan wrote. Analysis of their genetic markers shows evidence of at least 5 generations of close relative reproduction, resulting in a coefficient of inbreeding that approaches levels typically seen only in laboratory animal studies. Brennan's report detailed how genetic disorders had accumulated within the family line, creating individuals who were predisposed to mental illness, developmental disabilities, and physical abnormalities. His findings suggested that several family members had been born with cognitive impairments so severe that normal moral development would have been impossible. The surviving family members exhibit multiple genetic abnormalities that would have significantly impaired their ability to develop normal social and ethical frameworks, he concluded. Their actions, while legally criminal, may have been the inevitable result of profound genetic and developmental disabilities rather than conscious moral choices. The anthropological perspective came from Dr. Sarah Martinez, a cultural anthropologist from West Virginia University, who specialized in isolated Appalachian communities. Her evaluation placed the Crowley case within the broader context of extreme rural isolation and its effects on human social development. What we observe in the Crowley family is an extreme example of cultural devolution, Dr. Martinez wrote. Completely cut off from normal social interaction, they develop their own system and beliefs and behaviors that bear little resemblance to mainstream human society. Their cannibalistic practices, while abhorrent to us, were normalized within their closed cultural system. Dr. Martinez had spent weeks studying the family's primitive communication system, their religious practices, and their social structure. Her findings revealed a group of people who had essentially created their own civilization, complete with its own language, customs, and moral framework. The Crowley family operated according to rules that made perfect sense within their isolated context, she explained. They had developed elaborate justifications for their actions that were internally consistent, even though they violated fundamental human taboos. From their perspective, they were not committing crimes but following sacred traditions. The forensic psychiatric assessment, conducted by Dr. James Crawford from the state hospital system, focused on the individual mental states of each family member. His evaluation revealed the complex interplay between genetic predisposition, environmental conditioning, and severe trauma that had shaped their psychological development. Martha Crowley exhibits symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by genetic cognitive impairment and lifelong psychological conditioning. Dr. Crawford wrote, her ability to distinguish between right and wrong has been so fundamentally compromised that standard legal concepts of culpability may not apply. Dr. Crawford's assessment of the younger family members was even more disturbing. The 3 surviving children showed evidence of such severe developmental damage that they functioned more like feral animals than human beings. These individuals have been raised in an environment so removed from normal human society that they lack the basic cognitive frameworks necessary for moral reasoning, he noted. They have no understanding of concepts like empathy, individual rights, or the sanctity of human life as understood by mainstream society. The psychological evaluation also included testimony from Dr. Rebecca Holmes, a specialist in cult deprogramming who had worked with survivors of extreme religious groups. Her analysis focused on how the family's twisted theology had been used to justify and normalize their cannibalistic practices. The Crowley family operated according to a belief system that inverted normal moral values, Dr. Holmes explained. They were taught from birth that consuming human flesh was not only acceptable but sacred. Deprogramming individuals who have been raised within such a system is extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. The collective psychiatric assessment concluded with an unprecedented recommendation from the expert panel. Rather than traditional criminal prosecution, they suggested that the surviving family members be treated as victims of extreme abuse who required intensive psychiatric care rather than punishment. The Crowley family members are simultaneously perpetrators and victims, the summary concluded. They committed horrific acts, but they did so as a result of circumstances entirely beyond their control. Traditional concepts of criminal responsibility may be inadequate to address cases of such extreme psychological and social devolution. Artifact final court judgment, legal disposition of the surviving family members, including commitment orders, and the court's reasoning for unprecedented sentencing decisions. Judge Patricia Blackwood had spent 3 sleepless nights writing the final judgment in the Crowley case. The document, filed on a grey November morning 6 months after the family's discovery, represented one of the most complex legal decisions in West Virginia history. Her reasoning, carefully documented in the court record, would influence how similar cases might be handled for generations to come. This court faces an unprecedented situation, Judge Blackwood wrote in her opening remarks. We must determine the appropriate legal response to individuals who have committed heinous crimes while simultaneously being victims of circumstances that fundamentally compromise their ability to understand the moral and legal implications of their actions. The court's disposition of Martha Crowley, The family matriarch reflected the extraordinary nature of her case. Rather than criminal conviction, Judge Blackwood ordered her indefinite commitment to the state psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane, with treatment rather than punishment as the primary goal. Martha Crowley is found to be incompetent to stand trial due to severe mental illness and developmental disabilities, the judgment read. While her actions resulted in multiple deaths, the court finds that she lacks the cognitive capacity necessary for criminal culpability. She poses a continuing danger to public safety but requires medical treatment rather than incarceration. The decision regarding Thomas, the non-verbal male survivor, proved even more complex. Multiple psychiatric evaluations had concluded that he functioned at the developmental level of a young child, despite his physical age of approximately 22 years. Thomas Crowley presents a unique challenge to our legal system, Judge Blackwood noted. He participated in acts of cannibalism and murder, but did so under circumstances of such extreme coercion and developmental impairment that traditional criminal prosecution would serve no legitimate purpose. This court orders his placement in a specialized residential facility for individuals with severe developmental disabilities and violent histories. The youngest survivor, the pregnant 16-year-old known only as Jane Doe, to protect her privacy required the most delicate handling. Her condition as both perpetrator and victim of generational abuse created legal complexities that had never been addressed in American jurisprudence. Jane Doe represents perhaps the most tragic aspect of this case, the judgment stated. Born into systematic abuse and conditioned from birth to accept cannibalism as normal behavior, she bears responsibility for participating in murders, while simultaneously being the victim of horrific sexual and psychological abuse. This court orders her placement in a secure treatment facility for traumatized adolescents, with the understanding that her unborn child will be placed for adoption upon birth. The court's decision regarding the family property reflected both practical and symbolic consideration. The Crowley homestead was officially condemned and sealed, with ownership reverting to the state. Judge Blackwood's order specifically prohibited any commercial development of the site. Devil's Creek Hollow shall remain permanently closed to public access, the judgment declared. The site represents a crime scene of unprecedented scope and a location of such profound trauma that it would be inappropriate to allow any future habitation or development. The property shall be maintained as a restricted area in perpetuity. The financial aspects of the case created additional complications. Multiple families of missing persons had filed civil lawsuits seeking damages from the Crowley estate, but the family's complete poverty made meaningful compensation impossible. Attorney Robert Martinez, representing several victim families, had filed a motion requesting state compensation for the families of identified victims. Judge Blackwood's ruling acknowledged the moral imperative while recognizing practical limitation. While this court deeply sympathizes with the families who lost loved ones to the Crowley family's actions, the perpetrators possess no assets capable of providing meaningful compensation. The judgment noted, the court recommends that the state legislature consider establishing a victim compensation fund for cases involving such extraordinary circumstances. The disposition included provisions for long-term monitoring of the surviving family members. Patricia Walsh, the chief medical examiner, was appointed to oversee their ongoing psychiatric care and to provide regular reports to the court about their progress or deterioration. Given the unprecedented nature of this case, the court requires ongoing medical supervision of all surviving family members, Judge Blackwood wrote. Their conditions represent unique challenges to the mental health system, and their progress will provide valuable insights for handling similar cases that may arise in the future. The judgment also addressed the broader implications of the case for rural social services. Judge Blackwood used her decision to call for systematic reforms in how isolated families were monitored and supported.